Welcome everyone. Again, my name is Marcia Nedland. I am one of the organizers for the Middle Neighborhoods Community of Practice. Today we have a topic that is a pretty hot topic. ADUs in general is a hot topic. We're going to talk about it today in terms of it being a strategy for increasing housing supply in middle neighborhoods. But we're going to pause and do a poll. We want to start tracking more about sort of the sector our audience is coming from. So if you could complete that for us. Okay, I don't know if everyone can see it. We have 89% of people answering the poll. So that's really interesting, not surprising really to me. Nonprofits and local government are usually our biggest groups, but it's always fun to see people from other sectors as well. Okay, so, we have already shared the results, have we not? Okay, so let's just get started by letting me give you the very short version of what the Middle Neighborhoods Initiative is. It's a mostly volunteer-led initiative that is housed at the National Community Stabilization Trust. And the community of practice is supported by NeighborWorks America. We have a steering committee of researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. And it's basically an initiative to draw attention to middle neighborhoods across the country, which we feel or we know are disappearing either due to gentrification or to further decline. And we hypothesize that part of that is that people tend not to pay much attention to tracking what's happening with them or intervening in them, because we've sort of have assumed in the community development field that they can be on autopilot and be just fine. But if you look at the trends in those neighborhoods, first ring suburbs and rural communities, in fact, there's a lot going on with them all the time. One of the reasons we think they're so important to preserve is that they are the mixed income neighborhoods that so many of us in community development have said that we, are trying to facilitate, create in more distressed neighborhoods, et cetera. When we say middle neighborhoods, we don't have hard and fast metrics about that. In terms of income, I think most people think about 80 to 120, but that's really too narrow of a band. But mostly we say, if you think about the metropolitan area where you live or the county or whatever, and you think about the neighborhoods that are neither the most distressed nor are they the healthiest, those are probably your middle neighborhoods. They tend to be mostly single family stock, more than 50% owner occupied, though that could be eroding depending on what regional market you're in. One of the key aspects of housing stock in middle neighborhoods is that it tends to be in pretty good shape, but it's aging and it often lacks the features and updates that would allow it to compete well for today's home buyers. So a lot of the work you'll see in middle neighborhoods has to do with preserving the housing stock and updating it so that it continues to be able to attract home ownership and retain home ownership. One of the most interesting things to me about middle neighborhoods is that they are more racially, ethnically, and economically diverse than either their lower income or higher income counterparts. So again, these are those mixed income, mixed race, mixed ethnicity neighborhoods that we are all striving to achieve. Just wanted to call attention to a mapping tool that you can access there. You can also access it at ncst.org/middle neighborhoods. This is a rough way of being able to look at your MSA and just turn on the left side there, some of the income screens so that you can get a sense of what census tracts fall into some sort of middle range incomes, and we have different time periods as well. We actually are excited to be soon adding some more capability to go back more decades. You can also hover over census tracts and see what the race and ethnicity are too. So it can be a great starting point for conversation about where your middles are. So today we have an amazing panel. Our first panelist is Ellie Shield, and she's a research assistant and author with the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard. I watched her do a presentation about her recent study on ADUs at the Joint Center and was just amazed at how well she broke down a complex topic into some clear understanding of, for instance, as you'll see, what kind of state legislation tends to encourage the development of ADUs and what kind of legislation tends to inhibit it. And she, will give us examples of that. So you're going to love what she has to say. Chris Parker is going to talk to us as a practitioner. He's a deputy city manager and an AICP planner from the city of Dover, New Hampshire. New Hampshire has, I guess I'll be generous, maybe only in juxtaposition to California, which is where our next panelist comes from. But I think New Hampshire probably has a modestly supportive regulatory environment around ADUs compared to California, which has a very supportive regulatory environment. But Chris has managed to pull off in the small city of Dover more permitting of ADUs than any other place in the state of New Hampshire. And he's also done it in the context of a broader affordable housing strategy that's very well thought out. And I think is a great way for all of us to look at ADUs as one piece of a set of strategies we're doing to try and, produce the amount of units that we need. And then our last panelist is Lori Gay, who's the CEO at Neighborhood Housing Services of Los Angeles County. Lori's been around for a long time, as have I, and she knows how to do a million different things. And right now, her state is very supportive to the point that not only legislatively, but also they've invested millions and millions of dollars in funds to help spur the development of ADUs. And she's really, she's one of the participating organizations. She's a CDFI herself, her organization, who are working to get that money out on the street and to really help modest means homeowners to figure out how to do this. And she just has a really interesting insight on what's motivating people to do it in LA. And what the challenges are that they're facing and all of that. So that's our lineup for today. Generally speaking, we tend to try to allow for 20 to 30 minutes of Q&A at the end of all three presentations, but please do along the way type into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen any questions you have, and we may even be able to type in some answers along the way. So thank you to all the panelists for joining us today. And I'm going to turn things over to Ellie to get us started with sort of an overview of the big picture of ADUs and where things are at. Welcome, Ellie.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Marcia, and everyone with the Middle Neighborhoods Initiative for hosting me today. I'm glad that you liked my presentation so much because a lot of this today will be redundant and a speedier version. I did just want to note, prior to graduate school, I was a senior planner in North Carolina where we implemented ADU laws. And I think that's relevant and helpful because a third of us on this call here are in local government. So I can also lend that perspective as well. I recently graduated with my master's in urban planning here at Harvard, and I'm currently working on a master in real estate. As Marcia noted, I have worked as a graduate student researcher with the Joint Center for Housing Studies, and my co-author, David Luberoth, the deputy director, and I put together a report on ADUs. So I just want to iterate that the opinions today are my own and do not reflect Harvard or the Joint Center. Maybe one day I'll speak for Harvard, but not now. So just to sort of give an overview of our talk here, I'm going to try to keep this to under 15 minutes. I want to summarize my research and our key findings. Also, as the kind of introductory person on this call, really give a high-level overview of ADUs, definitions, some of the benefits and the hurdles that we identified in our report, and then dive into changes that are occurring at the state level and the 2 case studies that we looked more in depth into in our report, one of which included New Hampshire, which is how I met Chris, my co-panelist. So my research sort of started from this general observation that there is growing interest in ADUs, as Marcia noted, also known as accessory dwelling units, as really a useful tool to address housing challenges. And in response to this, we're seeing a growing number of local and a handful of states that have made it easier to build ADUs. Several other states, including my own here in Massachusetts, are currently considering this. So we dove in to ask, what can Massachusetts and other places looking to adopt ADU laws learn from other places that have recently done so? So we took the outline of just doing a literature review on the subject, interviewing experts, and digging into 2 case studies, city of Portland, Oregon, sort of as a gold standard, and New Hampshire. But for this conversation and its focus on middle neighborhoods, our findings do suggest that first and foremost, the importance of by right or administrative permit reviews, and as well as limiting localities' ability to impose other restrictions, namely parking and owner occupancy, is the first key step to increasing the supply of ADUs. And the second key observation is that when you go beyond policies, you can sort of break this cycle of barriers that ADU development faces, namely the lack of homeowner education, financing, and ADU specialized builders. And in those instances, like you see in Portland, you can really get an ecosystem of ADUs that helps them proliferate. So while accessory dwelling units go by a variety of names, and since on this call we're from all corners of the US, our research chose to define them as small independent living units that are within, attached to, or detached, but on the same parcel as the primary residence. And the diagram shown here is from the city and county of Denver. So the key distinction between a tiny home and an ADU is that it is subordinate to and functionally independent from the main house. And ADUs have an interesting history. They actually predate early zoning, beginning as ancillary buildings or carriage houses for workers on large farm estates or urban mansions. But they really became expressly prohibited in zoning as we see the rise of use-based Euclidean zoning in the middle of the century. However, new urbanism and its focus and preference for small infill housing kind of renewed interest in ADUs in the 1980s. And during that time, some localities and states began to take action. And those interests really carried into the 21st century. And that's when AARP became really involved in researching this subject, and in 2000 put out its first model for state acts and local ordinances. However, during that time, substantial changes in these laws remained relatively modest and rare until the mid-2010s. And so now we're seeing that most recently, many localities and states are considering code updates to ADUs. And like why we're on this call today, they really have become a part of this national dialogue around housing affordability. So real quickly, some lessons from our literature review and expert interviews. We categorize the benefits of ADUs into 4 main categories: economic, environmental, social, and health. And we recognize that those benefits extend to ADU occupants, homeowners, and cities. So by increasing supply, by increasing supply, ADUs have the potential to make all housing more affordable by providing affordable units in more expensive locations, and by providing homeowners additional rental income. They can offset a homeowner's housing costs and expand economic opportunities that advances a city's housing goals. Thirdly, by housing occupants who use generally less energy and have typically less number of cars per occupant, they offer housing within or along a city's existing infrastructure, and that can provide environmental benefits as well. And by creating distinct living quarters, but remaining somewhat connected to the existing home, they work really well for multi-generational housing models that expand occupants' health and well-being. And overarching across all of this is the fact that they have flexible designs and uses. And so they can fill many different uses and house many different types of occupants across their lifespan. So given that all of these benefits, why aren't we seeing more of these? And as some of you on that call might know, we identify zoning as both the main pathway, but currently a main hurdle to ADU development. So localities' main tool for hindering their development is requiring that they be approved by special or conditional use permits. This is in juxtaposition to the by right permits. So such permits are issued typically at the discretion of a public body, which is more often listening to opposed homeowners. And also some localities require, with owner occupancy, that the owner must live in the primary residence or the new ADU, or they might even go further to say that the ADU must be occupied by a relative or a caregiver, both of which our research finds these provisions are seemingly unique to ADUs. Owner occupancy supporters argue that this deters speculative development in these neighborhoods and that resident owners are more likely to take good care of their properties. Our research found no strong support of either of those claims. In fact, we noted that because of the higher cost on a per square foot basis to construct ADUs, that will typically dissuade investors. And more often than not, homeowners still live on the properties themselves, regardless of any requirement to do so. So for those out in Portland, there was a study done about 10 years ago that found 70 to 90% of ADUs in Portland are still built by homeowner developers, and almost 2/3 of those homeowners still live on site, even though there's no requirement to do so. Finally, many localities choose to allow ADUs, but often require off-street parking provisions that make it very cost prohibitive. That same study out of Oregon found that ADU users per occupant have 0.3 cars per ADU, and that's nearly almost half of the 1.53 cars per household citywide. So the users typically don't use as many cars, and these parking requirements can actually deter the number of ADUs that get built. And you see that in the city of Seattle, where they had owner occupancy and parking requirements until 2019. And during that time, the city saw substantially fewer ADU permits than nearby Portland, Oregon. So when we take all of these barriers together, we demonstrate in our research how this kind of creates a self-reinforcing cycle that prevents ADUs from being built. So when when few ADUs exist, really only a handful of homeowners will know about these great opportunities that they present, and therefore they don't even attempt to build them, especially if they've maybe heard from others that the process can be cumbersome and unpredictable. Secondly, if few ADUs are built, then there is a dearth of opportunities to finance new ones, particularly for moderate income homeowners, like the many homeowners in middle neighborhoods. And unless you have significant equity in your home or access to personal savings and funds, you really can't afford to build an ADU. So for instance, this study included on your chart here, coming out of California, found that a large majority of ADU owners still had to use personal savings for their construction. About 60% use personal savings, and another 43% had to or source some funds from the primary mortgage on the property. So if few ADUs are being built, then we're less likely to have designers and builders who really specialize in the unique site constraints and processes of ADU development. So I do just want to switch to show a chart because Marcia mentioned how we sort of compiled data on states that have passed ADU laws. So this chart here shows those that have enacted ADU legislation as of this fall and compares those with respects to sort of what we consider to be these three critical aspects: by right approval, ban on owner occupancy, and limitations on parking requirements. And we can go back to this during the discussion, but the key point is that the West Coast states like California, Washington, and Oregon have mature ADU legislation that leaves very little discretion to localities to impose by right, owner occupancy, and parking. These are also the states with the most ADU activity. In contrast, we were looking at New England states. And so, out in California, ADU permits now make up, based on our calculations, roughly 18% of new housing permits since 2010. In Portland, Oregon, that number is roughly 15. But for New England states, we don't have nearly as ambitious of laws, and we've also had historically less ADUs. So, for example, Connecticut recently adopted state law in 2021, but they allowed localities to opt out of this by right requirement. And that's significant because actually 2/3 of localities in the state of Connecticut chose to opt out. So even with state law, you get a hodgepodge of local approaches, and many of those approaches are very restrictive. So there appears to be this growing ADU momentum, particularly in the South, which some folks on the call might be. I also note after our research was published, my home state of North Carolina passed a House bill for ADU legislation that I believe is currently under consideration, and Massachusetts has some laws under consideration as well. So our first case study was Portland, Oregon, because it's really this gold standard of ADU development. It's marked not only by liberalized land use regulations, but it's really gotten to the point of fostering this ecosystem by removing other barriers and spurring non-zoning reform. So as I mentioned, while ADUs make up only 1.5% of the total housing stock, we estimate that they're comprising up to 15% of all new units built since 2010. And that's a significant number. So I'll sort of skip over the legislative history here, but they started allowing some form of ADUs in the 1980s. They eliminated this owner occupancy requirement in 1998. And this big change really occurred in 2010 when the city eliminated impact fees for ADU developments. And what that did was it gave homeowners at that time a $7,000 to $10,000 incentive of no impact fee requirements or no permit fee requirements to really kind of pull the trigger on ADU construction. So by 2016, they're issuing an annual ADU permits of upwards of 500 permits a year. And they held that for several years. And it's sort of leveled off now at 200 to 300 a year. But the city is routinely going back and loosening its restrictions. So it's this continual assessment of the codes that I think has made this very successful. The other key takeaway is just the importance of getting rid of zoning barriers and non-zoning barriers. So they've streamlined this regulatory environment, but they've also spurred advocacy initiatives, expansion of financial products, and builders that really specialize in ADU construction. Our second case, which I won't spend too much time on because I know Chris is from New Hampshire, but we chose New Hampshire because they have a relatively early adopter of state law, but one that leaves a lot of discretion to localities to impose provisions like special permits, owner occupancy, and having no caps on parking requirements. So within the New Hampshire framework, you can kind of see that the results across the state are really modest and uneven. And this chart shows some of the numbers and successes of a place like Dover, whose law predates state law with their ordinance, and how it's fit into this broader initiative. So our study looked to Massachusetts, and just to give a high-level overview here, and we can go back if you all are interested, but really, we have 351 jurisdictions in Massachusetts. Each has a different set of ADU laws because of this absence of strong state reform. There are some localities, particularly in Greater Boston, that are beginning to significantly change by allowing by right approvals. Notably, we've had some that have gone as far as property tax abatements for affordable ADUs, or also some places on the coast like Barnstable that provide zero interest loans to homeowners to commit to affordable ADUs. But we concluded by teasing out these merits and drawbacks and really weighing the pros and cons of incremental or comprehensive approaches to ADUs. And these are sort of our three key findings again. But as legislatures begin to consider, whether and how to change these laws, our findings are really first and foremost the importance of by right approvals. We believe that that's best done at the state level for a variety of reasons. The second is limiting localities' ability to impose owner occupancy and parking. And then the third is, when you get rid of those zoning barriers, you can begin to break this broader cycle that prevents ADUs from being built. Localities might need to be considering whether or not they allow detached ADUs, should ADUs be used for short-term rentals, how to provide financial incentives, and how do you collect this data at the state level. So we really feel with the comprehensive approach, you can get to promoting a true ADU ecosystem. So I'll leave it there, and I'll put the link for the full paper and hand it off to my co-panelist. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie. While Chris is teeing up, I wonder if you would comment, Ellie, on one of the things that talking to all of you made me see is that we ought to be thinking about ADUs similarly to however we allow like second rental units. Like, do we allow a duplex? And you made a brief comment on legislation that applies to ADUs but doesn't apply to other kinds of additional units. Can you
Yes.
sort of tee up that concept? Like we ought to not be thinking about ADUs as this radically different thing than a second unit?
Yeah, and that's something we can also discuss more as a group, but that was sort of our philosophy coming into this is anytime you're treating ADUs any differently than the underlying zoning or how you would treat a duplex, that's what's actually preventing them from being able to be financed and being able to be built. And so if you can come in and do a duplex that's completely a rental property, but you can't take a single family home and make the ADU a rental property, what's the point of having that policy to begin with? So it sort of undermines the intent of the zoning ordinance in many respects and makes it much more difficult to actually construct ADUs.
I think that's just an interesting phenomenon that we're all, our instinct is to think differently about ADUs. But I think Chris now is going to actually talk about how he addressed that in Dover, because he was looking at the rest of his zoning as well. So Chris, go ahead and take it away. Welcome.
Thank you, Marcia. My name is Chris Parker. I'm the Deputy City Manager for the City of Dover, New Hampshire. I've been with the city for about 27 years and served in the planning department for just over 20 of those years, including as the director for a number of years. I'm going to walk the viewers through a couple different things. First is the background. Where is Dover? What's driving our housing needs? How do we fit into the context of the state and the surrounding area? What we believe drives cost of housing here in the community, what we do in general, and how the ADU regs fit into that. And then finally, I think something that dovetails into what Ellie was talking about, why we want to do anything at all. So Dover was founded in 1623. We just celebrated our 400th year of European settlement. We are the 7th oldest community in the country and the first oldest, or the oldest, in the state. Interestingly, while we're the oldest community in the state, we're also the youngest community in the state, in the sense that our average age is 36 and the average age in New Hampshire is 43, which is the second oldest in the country. Only Maine has an older population. We have a population of about 33,000 residents. We are the 4th largest community in the state. And over the past 2 census periods, we've actually grown by over 3,000 residents in each of those cycles and have been the leader in growth in the state. In fact, in the 2010 census, we grew more than a few counties, which is an interesting thing to think about. And I recognize that while we feel large at 33,000 in this state, we are not large in the grand scheme. You can see on the slide there is a state of New Hampshire map with a subset to show you where we are within the state. We're on the seacoast region of the state. what I like to say is that if you take the Seacoast area and you add up the communities and the populations, we have about the same population as lives in the north end of Boston. So putting that into context, we are large for our area, but small in general. We have a council manager form of government, which is important here in New Hampshire because it allows us the flexibility of making and changing our regulations on a much more effective and efficient manner. Many communities in the state do what's called town meeting, and they effectively can only change their regulations, including their zoning, once a year. Dover, we can change it once a month if we need to. So our housing background, New Hampshire as a state is about 25,000 units shy of where it should be. That really stems from the hold off that occurred at the Great Recession in 2008. You can see on the chart, which was provided by the New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority, that we were moving along. We were having some great growth spurts. And then all of a sudden, 2008, 2009, 2010, things sort of frittered away. And we're gradually getting back to where we need to be, but it has been a very upward battle. Looking at some comparable communities, you can see that Dover does continue to provide more housing than a lot of our comparable communities. Nashua and Manchester on this list are the largest communities in the state. And then you see Concord, which is larger than Dover, but has provided less than its regional share. Just an interesting snapshot for you. This was data I pulled yesterday. Yesterday, there were 126 units listed for rent in the community, but when you actually drilled down to see if they were actually available, only 7 are available. There was one under $1,550. The average price of those 2-bedroom units was $2,500, and the HUD fair market rent here in Dover is $2,000. And that has gone up significantly over the past 4 years. We looked at this number starting in 2018 when we started recognizing we were in housing crisis, and that number was closer to $1,200 at that time. On the for sale side, there are 131 units, homes listed for sale, which is actually a fairly good increase over a year ago. And that when you stream out those that are pending or under agreement, you get 51. And then when you settle that down and say, well, actually, what is affordable? And that would be anything under $450,000. That is limited to 5 units. And there are 20 over 600,000. So you can see that in the middle there, about half are between $450,000 and $600,000 right now. So one of the things we've observed is that we look at what is driving our home costs here in the community and what is creating the problem we foresee. And we break it down into 5 areas. There's land cost, there's lumber cost. So land costs here in Dover, it is about $200,000 an acre to buy land, or a subset of an acre. We have a variety of density sizes here. The single family density ranges from 1 unit per 12,000 square feet to 1 unit per 40,000 square feet. We find there's not much distinction when we look at the land costs. Either way, it's about $200,000 for that buildable lot. The lumber cost, we're looking now between the lumber and the next L, which is labor, that it's about $250 a square foot to build a home today. So if someone is trying to build a 2,000 square foot home, right off the bat, they are at about $700,000 between the land, lumber, and labor costs. The next L is loans or lending. And that for a long time was a savior, because while land, lumber, and labor were increasing, interest rates were low, so the money was cheap, and that could offset the high cost of the construction of the home. And then the final L is legislation. And we have long thought that the #1 area that the community can be involved with is that legislative portion. One of the things that I was quoted numerous times when I was the planning director of saying is that I believe that regulations are meant to be rewritten. We aren't looking to create lasting regulations. We're looking to create regulations that allow us to be nimble and serve the needs of the community. And that means we should be looking at our regulations annually. And we do that here in Dover. Every January, the planning board and the planning staff identify regulations that they want to improve over the following year. And they make those the focus of the springtime with implementation over the spring, summer. So in that broader attainable housing theory, what do? Well, we allow multifamily housing in over half of the area of Dover. We allow manufacturing housing in most residentials. We have a variety of densities. While it says here 1 unit per 2,000 to 1 unit per 40,000, the reality is that in 2 of our mixed use districts in the central business district, we have no density. So you can get as many units as you can fit. We have encouraged rooming houses, and we have also recently adopted the idea that there should be no single family zoning. So in 2021, we made a change so that 2-family dwelling units are allowed in all single family zones. On the use side, we are encouraging of mixed uses. So a lot of our commercial zones allow residential to be built as part of a mixed use project. We have allowed accessory dwelling units. The state, as we saw, addressed them in 2016. We actually saw this as an issue to embrace in 2009, and it took a little bit of time to finally accept those. And so, as Ellie pointed out, in 2012, we adjusted our regulations, and I'll get back into that in a few minutes. We encourage customary home occupations. We want to have people being able to live and work in the same spot. Home sharing, also called co-housing. We have a number of scenarios where folks that have outgrown their home don't want to move out. And instead, what they do is they rent their bedrooms as separate leasable spaces. So they get 2 keys. The tenant does, one to the general house and the kitchen, living room, dining room area, and then one to the individual bedroom. And finally, we have long promoted adaptive reuse and conversion, and we've had an aggressive use of our transfer development rights parcel property that came into being here in 2003. And at this point, it's probably driving most of our density because, as you might imagine, through a 400-year-old community, we don't have a lot of green land left. And so what we do now is we allow the use of transfer development rights. You're basically buying land or credits that the Conservation Commission has set aside and using the development rights. And we have a sliding scale. If you are going to have the units as attainable units, then there is no charge for that credit. If you are going to have them as fair market or rental units, then there is a charge of $15,000 per unit. So what do our accessory dwelling unit rights look like? Well, we are a by right community. You just need to come in and get an administrative approval. We do not want you going to the planning board or the zoning board. We have the building permit application at the same time, so it is a coterminous application. We do require a deed restriction on the property that it remain owner occupied, and if there is water and sewer, which is about 80% of our community, that it needs to be tied to the main property owner. One of the things that Ellie mentioned with this was the driving force why we do owner occupied, and it's actually made me rethink it as we've been having these conversations, she and I, is that we wanted to prevent against investor. We wanted it to not become a investor issue. One of the genesis of our conversation was that we saw our proximity to UNH, the University of New Hampshire, which is in Durham, the next community over. We saw a lot of people, grad students in particular, looking for places to live, and we saw a lot of our elderly residents looking for a way to stay in their house. And this ability to create this secondary unit, which they could rent to grad students, or in my case, I had seen it as a way to have my child go to the UNH, but not actually live in my house, because everyone deserves a little separation. And that was an opportunity. And then we also saw a lot of downsizing where the parents own the house, but don't need the large house, but their children and their new families need the larger house. So the elderly parents move into the dwelling unit, and then the main house is used by the family. We've seen that a lot. Dimensionally, we require between 300 and 800 square feet of space be cemented. We do require the one parking space per unit. We can allow them to be in the accessory structure or the principal structure. And we do allow more than one accessory dwelling unit. And this is unique to Dover, and no other community in the state has this provision. But we didn't see a reason to say you can only have one unit, one accessory dwelling unit. So we allow multiple accessory dwelling units. Anything over the first one has to be an attainable. So that means that it has to meet the HUD fair market rent for that size unit in the region. And we've done it that way because we want to promote attainable housing. We are looking at some financing options. We have a staff person who is working with a series of banks to look at financing means to help people put these accessory dwelling units in their houses and stay. We are also looking at the elimination of the accessory dwelling unit as a standalone use and just calling it a two-family duplex. We don't know if the state statute actually allows us to do that, because the statute explicitly says any zone that allows single-family homes has to allow an accessory dwelling unit. So we are looking to see from a statutory standpoint, if we say, okay, we just allow duplexes, does that get us around that statutory provision? So that's something that we're looking at in the future, because we want to continue to embrace this use style. Why do we want to continue to embrace it? Because we want healthy living. We want community building. We are a community that wants to make sure that we have diversity, that we have people that can come, move into a house, stay in that house, grow their family, and not have to leave the community. We are a big fan of aging in place. And we're also big fans here of the idea that the more people in our community, the more we can have a diverse of views, and the more community building and the stronger our community is. So we encourage that walkable, diverse housing that comes from accessory dwelling units and these other strategies that we've embraced. I'm looking forward to answering any questions later on, but for now, I'm just going to end my portion and pass it on to Lori.
Thanks a lot, Chris. That's really interesting. And I already have bunches of questions for you myself. So Lori Gay is the CEO of Neighborhood Housing Services of Los Angeles. And as I said in the intro, I'm not sure if you were here yet, she knows a lot about everything to do with community development. Her organization is a CDFI lender. And so they just do all kinds of stuff, every possible trick you can think of to revitalize communities and preserve and create affordable housing. And now she's on the latest thing. And as she put it to me, her organization is all in on ADUs, and she is working in a state that has very supportive regulatory environment and funding environment for ADUs. So Lori, welcome and thanks for coming.
Thank you. And Marsha's going to help me with slides because I didn't know what I was doing. But I just say to everyone, you know, the goal of any community developer, right, is to embrace what's in front of them and then look ahead to the future if we can. And so NHS is 40 this year. We should be looking ahead. I can't believe it. I think we've known each other 30 and 40, right?
Yeah, I think so.
We're young now. And then I also want to mention some of my team is on the phone. They dumped in slides. I dumped in slides late last night. And we know we missed everything. And I'm so grateful to both of my counterparts, Ellie and Christopher, who just spoke, because they teed it up differently than I will. We're kind of the boots on the ground, get it all done. So my presentation focuses around people, property, and the market. And so I think I looked at and was taking notes from their slides too. So it's exciting. We all should be talking. Glad to be here. So a couple of key challenges out our way. And some of my team members, I know with webinars, they can't just jump in, but if they put their emails in the chat, right, Marsha, then
Sure,
people can reach back to them and get more information. On the people side, the biggest focus we always have at our organization, our business, and we have 3 companies that are operating interchangeably. So that's why she was trying to describe it as we do some of everything. There's Gerald there in the chat. He's our policy guy and deals with all kinds of ADU policy all the time. And I thought I saw Milena too, and Juanita. How do people want to live? So that's our fundamental question that drives us. And what we're seeing post-COVID is the ADU is hot because people want to live differently. There's fear that, I'm going to lose a loved one and I lost somebody already during COVID, all that kind of thinking. And then there's just the reality that intergenerational living matters for everyone. And I think it's the first time in my career, I've been at community development at least 35 years. I've never seen it like this. When we talk ethnically, it was Latino families and Asian families from everywhere that would live together and make life work. And Blacks and whites didn't do that. And so to see some of everyone coming in now of every economic strata trying to figure out how to stay together and be in a safe, habitable space, whatever that is. We don't tell people how to live at our organization. What we do is try to say, oh, here's 10 options. Pick one, and please don't end up on the street homeless. We have several hundred thousand minimum homeless in our region, and the numbers keep going up. People are living in RVs. I mean, it's a lot. And so to find a habitable, safe space matters. Then it's what can they afford? What does an ADU mean for their family budget? How will they live if they have these ideas? I'd say 80-90% of the people want to live beyond their budget. They've got a beer budget. Hills House, it's no. ADU is going to be 400 to 600 square feet. The cost of that property piece, what makes sense, right? And so out here, I mentioned it in a later slide, but I'll mention it here as well. Anywhere from 120 to 160,000 is kind of the prefab costs we're seeing. And then if it's new construction, it could go up to a couple of $100,000 for the same 400 square foot thing, 450, same basic property. And then Gerald from our team that I just mentioned went to see a 3D house recently, and he kept emphasizing students built it in like 3 days, but it was 250 grand. So when we think about the modest income, everyday working public, and the language changes all the time, so I don't claim to know what everybody calls themselves. I call it normal, right? When you think about the regular people like most of us, those are real big numbers. We've been in the home rehab business 40 years, and that's been a primary thrust here, like any group that's named NHS pretty much in the country. But I think it's difficult. And so as we look at get them in, keep them in as our main business modeling, affordable home ownership is 99% of what we do. Our model doesn't work if people can't afford it because we want them to stay. So when you're dealing with an existing homeowner, then you got to ask these questions. What does the market then drive? Is this a major business line for future housing supply? Should we change our whole world to accommodate it? Well, I would suggest that we did in NHS in Los Angeles to some extent. And some of that was driven then by the money side. So for us, it's people, property, marketing, money. And the money side kicked in and people got excited, and then we got thrust into it differently than in the past. We've always built ATUs. We've always done conversions, granny flats. That's not new business. It's just named differently, and everybody's paying attention and has different needs. So last few questions then, how do we ensure affordability? Who pays for it? How do we use it as an economic development strategy if we want to help people have jobs? Next slide. Oh, Marsha. So this is a little before that one of our construction guys ran out and took the second picture yesterday and doing a garage conversion. So that's a chunk of the requests that come in. Nightmare, more expensive than just doing something with a slab in the backyard, or if it's a prefab to be able to move it in, right? And we'll talk about the distinctions in a minute. Let's see what his after is looking like. Almost done. So they got to clean up some, take the ladder out, all that. But he just did some side views because it was easier to show that same space, right? And with all new siding and windows and everything put in well. Next. So what's our policy around it? Gerald noted here for you some of the bills that you could look up that pushed us all into it. trying to make sure that we paid attention. And I think it became a huge buzz in California over the last 3 years as COVID was just starting to slow, but certainly during COVID as well. And it's because of these assembly bills. One of the best things they did in our legislature was encourage foreclosure interventions, mortgage relief, right, for homeowners, and tenant protections, tenant relief. That got way past what I think anyone projected, but that's what was going on. And then these assembly bills that help say, you know, people can put something in their backyard and we think it's great and let's get it done. Next slide. So what Milena did, she just, I think, put her email in the chat so you guys can talk to her. She's the map and data person in our world and just knocks it out of the park. She wanted you to just see in this last round, mid-December, all the reservations that were made for a new program that, well, it's not new, but an expanded program that our state housing finance agency put out. And what's important about this, just a little graphic, it's difficult because our county, you know, is 900 square miles, you guys, some of your states. So when Christopher was talking about size and scale, I just was thinking, wow, one neighborhood in LA is 100,000 people on average. But, and what a beauty that Christopher can get all the work done and really see impact. We don't have the beauty of that most of the time. And we have some target neighborhoods we work in and it's still just tens of thousands of people, right? But you see this spread. And so part of it from a business perspective is how do you service it? And when we do some of everything for people, from the financial education to the loan to the construction piece, project management, you know, it's a lot. And everybody doesn't want it all, but I'd say 95% do. And of the 10 agencies statewide that are managing to the housing finance agencies programming for ADUs in terms of getting their money on the street, we're one, I think, of 3 that kind of does it soup to nuts. And I know our scale is significant because we are doing all of it. We'll do the next slide. So we had 138 reservations in this last round, and here's a little bit on the clients. 15 to 20% or more of the clients are coming in with free and clear properties. So as a CDFI, you know, we pay attention to that. As a realtor, we're also a licensed realtor, broker. You know, this is a standard model that's getting repopularized nationwide, Marcia, but this has been us for 40 years. The remainder of the families tend to have high equity because California is overpriced, ridiculous, high demand, low supply. The clients are coming in, I mentioned this earlier about intergenerational, but it's also they need the money. You know, and if they can pool their money together and have grandma move to the back house of 400 or 500 square feet, and then the family that is wanting to live together lives in the front, that might be a 1,500 to 1,700 square feet, maybe up to 2,000 sometimes square foot property. This is really a phenomenal way to live in a town and a region and a state that's so overpriced. We don't like to talk about it. It's embarrassing because it does speak to public policy, right? And that we haven't gotten our work done. And there's lots of land mass. So what's our problem, right? And I think that is kind of the California stigma. There are other states that are similar. So this is why you see the legislation push this way. In terms of the pipeline that came in on this last round in December, the portal for the state opened on the 11th. And in a week and a half, this was our results after over 400 and some people turned in every document imaginable to be reserved. And this book of business was all low income. So it wasn't your blended middle neighborhood. And I want to distinguish that. In the first round that hit last April, same kind of numbers almost overnight, we had a little near almost 500 people apply online to us to try to get in. And I think it was 26 that got reserved. And the portal blew up in 25 minutes. So what was the difference? That moderate to middle income group was allowed. And those folks came from all over. You think the map we just showed you is extensive. It was exhaustive in terms of how many moderate income families, middle income, that range. in finance, we talk about it as the 100. So say the 80 to the 150% AMI group came in and they sucked up the money quicker than ever. Took a little longer with low income families. And of course, we want both books of business because we believe in mixed income communities to make the world better. We have another 23 that were from prior periods that are waiting in plan check, under construction, whatever's going on with them. And so our systems change became how we get buddies with every planning department we could, all building and safety, Department of Water and Power, the utility companies. So it put a real press on the business. Back to costs. Those are some of the costs we've been able to track so far that you see at the bottom there. And the prefab space is still not all done. And we started on it last June, really. And so we've been stripping it down. Lots of manufacturers, but how do you get that house on the slab and the utilities connected without losing the shirts of the family? And then more importantly, it's the contractors. We require a special designation for a prefab contractor, and there just aren't enough of them. There were only like 19 in all of Los Angeles County. You think about that. We have 10 million people. So guess how busy they are, right? So we just brainstormed a deal with one of our affiliates who we love, MPHS. I don't know if any of their staff are on the phone today, but they were getting stuck at some of the same things we were. So we said, let's see if we can share contractors in a way that it works. So we're trying to figure out now how to get those specially licensed prefab guys working with our normal general contractors and then knock it out of the park, and they can help each other and everybody wins and the family gets what they need. What I did not mention here on cost is timing. So a stick built in our space is going to be 7 to 12 months of work. So let's just say a year when you're being conservative. The prefab is 3 months in the factory, 1 week installation. So not only cheaper, but faster, better materials than stick built. We know wood rots, right? And so those are the things, we'll go on to the next slide. We're trying to figure out, right, to make it better for families. Financing for the lower income families on this round, the ones that reserve that grant. We then also have funding from another state program, and I'll just quote these rates. I don't put them out everywhere, but it's 3% fixed for 30 years with no payments for low income families. So you think about going into a thing with 140,000 where you're good for a while, right? And you can start to make rents. You want to pay down the principal on that ADU over time. It's a sweet deal. But of course, we only have enough money for 40 or 50 of those this time, right? And we've got 138 people being processed. So we start repackaging ourselves as a CDFI and then figuring out ways for notes to be purchased, refer to our friends. It becomes a little bit of a frenzy that we work through and say to the families, don't leave. Let's figure it out. We're trying to help you make your home situation better, because you see all the shirts with Home Matters. We're still that group, Marcia. We're still using that whole thing and encouraging the families to not give up, right? And to stick with us. If they don't like it and they want to go work with another agency, no problem. But I think in the end, us offering that soup to nuts, including project management, has been a big deal for people. You see some of the totals on the financing there. New construction, prefab can be cheaper, the time. All right. So we're trying to encourage every low income family to do prefab. Let us finish this last little piece for you and let you get in there. Now, you want a 2-story, 800 square foot unit. That's a different discussion. You're going to have to hock up your house. And then how do you pay for it? And if you're moving your relatives in, will they be good tenants? So then offering the landlord education, people don't want it. It's not their first thought. But if you're a new buyer and you're doing this, or you're an old homeowner that wants to just have us all together for the practicality, right? And life, you have to think through how you spend. And so that's the beauty, I think, of all of the CDFI and NeighborWorks Network members and other HUD housing counseling groups. It gives us a chance to work with people and make sure that families are okay. The moderate income, most of them are going to use home equity, some kind of HELOC, and then they may hustle us to manage the funds and do the project management. So if they're not, using state money, there's no special grant program for them. The one we did back in May and June included them, and many of them, throughout the state got that grant, which was phenomenal. But Cal HFA looked at it and said, never again, kind of attitude. I mean, they might come back to it. But the first round was $100 million. Got spent up in 25 minutes, right? And then the next round was 25 million plus a little. And so I think that we're encouraging certainly legislation and policy around this. Next slide. Okay, core clients, little demography, you see it there. What I did was blend all products because we have a number of points of entry, whether it's pre-purchase or post-purchase. Families are coming in talking ADU in 10 ways, not one. And so you can see the love between the Blacks and Latinos. They flip-flop all the time in our world. Families trying to figure it out. White families more so on the ADU space as we added moderate income people, right? And I say yuppies, buppies, and chuppies. We had a number of young urban professionals coming through of all ethnic backgrounds. Asian, multi-race, growing number everywhere. And people are designating differently, right? And then our native families also that are moving in to neighborhoods that might have been seen as not so great, or they're already there and trying to figure out, families are trying to figure out how to stay. This AMI piece, we talked about that. Age, a big driver in the business we're in now, where we have a bunch of folks who are older, who are participating, particularly in the ADU space, because they want to live differently with their families. Females were leading again. The status I asked my team, we're really watching it. Look at the widowed person who is participating in the ADU space. This is just unbelievable. Married, single, disabled, right? Family sizes. This is huge. And so I think what you're really seeing there is a composite of a whole family unit, however it's defined, right? But that people have 50 reasons they might consider the ADU space and or building an ADU after they purchase a property, right? To help offset costs and to keep their family together. Next slide. And that's the contact us stuff on how to reach us. Marsha's in charge. But I think what I just say to all of you, and I think there's one more slide for social media. That picture right there, I put that at the end because it says everything we think. Really about home mattering and revitalizing our communities. We see ADUs as a tool to not only increase housing supply, but the human spirit. And that families figuring out ways to thrive together is the business we're all in, right? It doesn't matter what space you come from, but that we want to be available to people. And I'm really excited about the opportunities we have to use this old method in a new way to change communities for the better. We are a part of a, I don't know what we'd call it. Gerald would correct me if he was able to talk on the phone right now. A group, though, that's applying for all kinds of federal money, from climate change to workforce to infrastructure bill. Marsha, I told you about them. And that space, right? Their applications are considered the largest housing ask in the history of the country to build 10,000 ADUs a year.
Wow.
Now, Christopher, you and I know from a planning perspective, okay. I told the guy that we joined with, if we get 1,000 done a year, I will kiss the ground, right? Because it'll change the lives of so many families. And the money is, it's there to pay for it. And we're back and forth with our friend about how to package it as a CDFI, right? Because that's our role. But I just say to you guys that this is not going away. So I'll stop there. Appreciate it. Thanks.
That's amazing, Lori. Thank you so much. And I got to know more things than I did before, even though we've talked about your program. One of the things that you sort of breezed past was the the bill, I assume it's actual law now that you can make an ADU a condo, so someone could independently own it. Is that allowable?
Yes, very interesting. And the parcel splits will be welcomed. And
That's
now we haven't
amazing.
tested that yet, but guess what the new buyer conversation becomes, right? And or the family conversation if grandpa, I'll stop just focusing on women. If grandpa wants to
Mhm.
make sure, right, that there's his heirs, right, have a chance to own, but they can't afford to own the whole home.
Mhm. Yeah.
Just to add on to that on a policy level, Portland was I think the first place to do that, and it's now become state law. That is unusual, and like that on the East Coast where you know, you're always compromising with these sorts of things, that would almost be like a deal breaker. Like I would be thrilled if that were to happen, but we've just got to get them allowed in the first place. But it also helps not just like the folks I interviewed in New Hampshire, where it was older folks that had sold their home and were downsizing to an ADU. They're the ones putting $200,000 of capital into the project, but they're not getting any of, you know, any rights to that asset. And it also would help lenders feel more comfortable if these were condoized, because it gives them collateral. So it
Absolutely.
can be extremely helpful for many different parties in the process.
Yeah, and I think, Ellie, what you have is lenders, by definition, your typical conventional lenders, are going to avoid risk like the plague, blame the regulator. That's just normal, not picking on anybody. And we have to work through that. And that's my thing with people now. I've been at it so long. I'm like, no more excuses. Let's find the solutions. Where is it? Let's sit here. Let's do it. And so Gerald's putting something in the chat.
He
Cities
said
have
city
to opt into it.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
So-
so I think we'll get there, right? But we have to push.
Yeah. A little point of clarification I thought might be helpful to our audience, because I read it at your website, Lori, was that with the HFA grant program, there are a bunch of approved lenders people can go through, and then there's a smaller group of other organizations like yours that people could go through. So, in that.
Yeah, well, there's two distinctions. One is who's passing through the money, right? Which is what most of our groups are doing. And then if they sign up with that lender, then it's how do they get it done? Right. And some of the groups too of the 10. So thank you for that clarity. I'd say most of them are not trying to do soup to nuts like we are. That's just been always our model.
Yeah.
So we did it, but I think a lot of people are helping people, they connect dots for them, or they say, go find your contractor. And so I think our system is a little more closed in for the reason that we see people struggle and sometimes make predatory choices versus responsible lending choices because they don't know. But the lenders that are there, I think most of them we don't know. And that was our other thinking. And I don't care if somebody shows up with their own money, fine. But it's all got to be in a space to be managed, right? So I think these are old school tricks for making sure, particularly when people are modest income, they're okay. And then we're trying to get to know all those lenders because many of them are mortgage companies, not the typical banks. So I think that's part of the disconnect sometimes with the housing finance agencies. You know, it's just whoever signs up. And so we're talking to them about that. It doesn't mean that pick a bank is the only option or the right option. It's just finding something that fits for that client.
But you have 126 in your pipeline now or something like that, but that
138.
38. And then how many, do you have any sense of the scale of permitting of ADUs that's happening countywide? You know, so you're just
Yeah,
really.
you would ask me countywide. I don't have a sense of the county because they're a little crazier on the implementation side. That's our experience. The city of LA and certain other small cities have been more formidable. And so Gerald and I'm mentioning Gerald today because we're in policy spaces, but we met in advance, and then I have to bug my staff to not sit on stuff, meaning if we need to hire an expediter, let's spend that money to get our family through. That's a sound business investment, right? Let's not just wait for plan review. They have a max of 60 days to respond, but what if they respond with 8 things that take another 2 months.
Yeah.
We don't want that. We want the expediters who think about this all day to get in there, right? So our families can get what they need as quickly as possible. Some of the other smaller cities, big struggle, right? But LA's massive. And so they're approving a lot. And then what they did that again, I know Christopher, you too, Ellie, is they pre-approved 20 or 30 plan sets. And you just pick one. And I say to people all the time, why would you start over? Why are you trying to customize in a city this big? Just get started. You can always add on some more to your add-on.
Yeah, I think the broader point here is you shouldn't have to hire an expediter to get an ADU permit. You shouldn't have to hire an attorney. You shouldn't have to hire an architect to come in and do renderings to get an
Exactly.
ADU. LA has been extremely successful, not even, I mean, California permitting is a beast of its own, but one thing that's made LA really kind of drive the numbers in California is they've created more pathways to legalize non-conforming ADUs than many
Yes, I agree.
places. And so
They really do have an
yeah.
open mind. They want to beat the 60 days.
Yeah, and
Now
I
we're going to have
believe-
to push our Department of Water and Power to
Yeah.
agree with that, but
And Lori, you might know more about this, but this really comes down to the interplay of nonprofits and also HCD in California's case, because I understand that they're also trying to change state laws and become more involved in holding these smaller jurisdictions accountable to actually getting these permits knocked out in time. So
they are. And from a policy perspective, we're all buried. We come up for air when we do. But I think that the nonprofit advocates, we can do a better job of joining together to make
We
sure
have-
they know what's really happening on the ground.
yeah, and I know we have plenty of topics to get to. I just want to make 2 points on the lending topic before we switch gears. The first, to Lori's point, like national banks right now aren't even really touching ADUs. They're starting to have conversations with it. It just goes to show, because the markets vary place by place, national banks can't create the standardization that they need to de-risk these types of loans, as we discussed. So it's really relying on state agencies, maybe localities, to step in and say, okay, we're going to offer 0% loan opportunities for this to really reach middle neighborhoods, or also regional banks now coming into feeling more comfortable because they have a better handle on the market and knows, more closely what that risk looks like. The GSEs, Fannie and Freddie, they're beginning to make some policy changes. So for me personally, I would argue until the Fannie and Freddies really step up and begin to back some of these mortgage loan options, that's when ADUs can really take off. California research is also suggesting the importance of construction loan offerings for these. So you don't have to come in and do much related to your existing mortgage on a property, but have a construction loan that will help finance these ADUs. So those are kind of the 2 finance points that I'd like to make.
Well, and let me add a third combined with a fourth, Ellie, real fast, so people have it in their view. The CDFIs that do this work, there's just not as many. They're getting into it, and conversations like this help. Are also looking at different ways to work with regional lenders. The big nationals know to buy down rates to make this stuff work. And so I think groups like mine thinking about becoming and then filling out the application to become an FHA lender. In a million years, you could have paid me and I would never think we'd be there. But their latest move at FHA on ADUs, if you're watching it, where you can count 50% of the projected income to qualify, it matters. And then when we met with the guy who helped create the program, we talked about buying down rates, because market rate for everybody doesn't work right now, but they still have a huge need within their family unit. So this is why it takes a little bit of all of us. But I do think the regional banks and lenders are much more formidable. In Los Angeles, the LA Reach program, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it, took them 4 years, but they got to a place where some of those regionally sized shops are now investing in local CDFIs to do the work, because they're still skittish about creating their own products, all of which we don't sweat that. There's so much demand, it's going to take all of us to service it.
I wanted to note that Michael put in the chat about there's also a property tax abatement, 10-year, 100% property tax abatement on increased value due to ADUs, which is fascinating. That's kind of a big deal. I remember talking to somebody in Portland, Oregon, Ellie, and this was during the time when they were starting to encourage more ADUs, but according to her, they hadn't really thought through the implications of the fact that the very next year, people would be hit with a much bigger property tax bill. So they had to sort of retrench and fix that. But Chris or Ellie or anybody, what are the property tax implications about all of this? And is there variation across the country?
So New Hampshire, the property tax is king because we have no income or sales. So the assessor does view it as a variable to consider. It's actually one of the reasons I've been told by people why they don't do the duplex option, because the accessory dwelling unit has a lower assessed value, typically because of that 300 to 800 square foot limitation.
I see.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, and Michael, I think you might be calling in from Massachusetts, but property tax abatement is like, I've really been thinking about this as like upfront and recurring subsidies. And if a place, I know we have a lot of local people on this call, if you really want to incentivize ADUs to get built, find creative ways to offer both. For example, the waiving of the impact fees, that's going to get people in the door immediately because they're going to know, oh my gosh, I got to do this now. If I don't, I have a $10,000 incentive to come in and permit this now. Then the property taxes can be that recurring subsidy that occur every single year that really allows the cash flow of the ADU to make sense for people to build for the long haul. And it also leaves jurisdictions the opportunity to impose things that are like a sweetener with this, to say, okay, if you come in and you build a luxury ADU and you want to rent it at an above market rate, yeah, you're going to be paying property taxes. But if you dedicate that ADU to someone that is, at a certain area median income threshold, well, then we'll abate your property taxes. The benefit to the city is that if you begin to tie ADUs as an incentive to become affordable housing opportunities, you're saving the city a heck of a lot of money on a per unit basis for any affordable housing that they don't have to provide. And it's also a lot cheaper for developers. I mean, even here in Boston, we're seeing the average affordable housing unit is $600,000 to $700,000 to build one affordable unit. You could come in and have homeowners build 5 ADUs with affordability restrictions that save the city, the occupant, and the homeowner money.
We've looked at the impact.
Go ahead.
We've looked at
Christopher,
the
I'm sorry.
impact fee. We've looked at the impact fee conversation here. We've had impact fees since 2003, and our impact fees on single family are about 9,000. It's 6,000 for a duplex unit and 3,000 for a accessory dwelling unit. We're actually in the process right now of implementing a waiver of any impact fees for attainable units. So if you do that rental restriction, then you do save the 3,600 or 8,000/9,000 depending on your level. And we're hoping that helps spur continued growth in the attainable area.
I see that Isaac has a raised hand, so probably wants to speak. Can we unmute Isaac? Or can Isaac, if you can unmute yourself? Let's see. And Peter too. Anne, are you able to unmute?
Yes,
Wow.
please.
Oh, there you go. Go ahead, Isaac.
Yeah, good afternoon to you all. Thank you once again for sharing this valuable information. So with the ADUs, there are certain zoning districts that doesn't allow ADUs to be constructed within per the zoning. And within this, well, how has the zoning or zoning ordinance impacted developers to construct ADUs on a property?
So is your question, about what you should do if your zoning doesn't currently allow for ADUs?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Well, that's, yeah. How
So I
how
think-
did people zoning changed, Christopher?
So I think that question comes down to the question earlier of whether you think of it as a separate use or whether you look at it as a unit and just call it through a density provision. We called it out as a specific allowed use because that's what we saw it, and we used the term accessory dwelling unit, although at the time, we certainly heard granny flat, we heard in-law apartment, we heard all of the sort of nomenclature. And we looked at it and said, we want to call it an accessory dwelling unit, and then we put the provisions in our zoning code to help clarify the process and the requirements.
Mhm. Isaac, do you work for local government?
I'm with the Works Inc. It's a non-profit organization into housing development.
Yeah.
I'm planning associate with the Works, and what I do is to provide oversight to ensure compliance with city zoning ordinances.
Oh, I see. I see. Yeah. So, there certainly is, in many, many places, there is no legislation about ADUs necessarily. So we're all have an opportunity to organize people who are interested in this and to advocate for that kind of policy change. I also wanted to give a chance to Peter, raised his hand, and he also had a question in the chat. Peter, can you unmute yourself? Peter Duval?
I think I am unmuted, right?
Okay, great, you are.
Yeah, I'd love to see some of that zoning legislation posted up because that's what I'm most interested in. I'm actually working with a neighborhood that's getting lots of requests from investors for 2-unit buildings, and they're not happy about it at all. They're trying to prohibit it. And they already have a lot of bad investors in the neighborhood and a lot of vacant buildings, so it's not like it's overcrowded. But there is interest in true accessory units. They would, a small unit on the first or third floor of one of the neighborhood's row houses is something that they're actually open to, but they really don't want those investors coming in and splitting all the houses with 2 equally sized units that on multiple floors. So
What I'll
anyway,
do is I'll send the moderators the legislation we have as well as our application, which is a 1-page simple application to utilize for an administrative approval.
perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
know,
Sorry. Two
No,
quick
you go,
points,
Ally.
if I may, Marcia. The first is like, we're seeing institutional investment in home purchases across the board here nationally. I mean, it's millennials like me, we can't outprice large institutions that can outbid us and put way more cash up front. So that is not an acute problem only to ADUs, but Peter, to your point, there's a policy ability now for ADUs to become the compromise, to say, look, if NIMBYs are fearful of eliminating single family zoning districts or upzoning, well, maybe there's wiggle room for ADUs to kind of be the middle ground and the compromise.
I think they're already open to that. So
Great.
they're already there
Peter, where are you at?
in Baltimore.
Oh, in Baltimore, yeah, okay.
Yeah, and this is a neighborhood with a lot of vacancy, 500 vacant homes or so, but some investor interest, a substantial investor interest. But they're like buying houses, and then they find out they can't get financing for them as single families, so then they're going and asking for 2 units from the neighborhood. So my banker told me I can't get financing, and we're like, well, why'd you buy it?
Yeah, that's not the kind of investor that you want. I mean, I was case that, I sometimes counsel or to even at least consider for neighborhood residents that if the real estate market in your neighborhood is if it's really undervalued, et cetera, you may not get those vacant buildings fixed unless you use investors to do at least part of it with some guidance and management of what they're doing. So it's sort of like, I try to have a conversation about, okay, we're clear about what you don't want. Let's talk about what you do want, and let's figure out how we can mitigate the things you're most afraid of, but still get you the most of what you want. So
Yeah, there's already plenty of investors willing to do them in single families, but some of the really green investors that don't know what they're doing,
Oh,
they're
yeah,
the
that's-
ones that are really asking for the 2 units.
yeah. Well, I'm aware that we only have 1 minute left, and fortunately, a lot of the questions that got posted in the Q&A were answered in the Q&A by our panelists, and I really appreciate that. Oh, Maryland legislature approved a bill, and now the ADU task force is meeting to discuss. Yeah, is there there's not like a national association of ADUs or anything yet where people could find the bank of model legislation and stuff like that?
No, sadly there isn't. But I would say I put the link into our paper and that should have citations for
Yeah.
each state. The other thing is nationally, I would say the AARP is really kind of on point with these issues. So if you find your state and Google AARP, in many places they're advocating for these
That's a good point.
changes.
I found out about that when I listened to Ellie do this presentation previously, and I followed the links, and it was really fascinating to see how much AARP is behind this tool. And they have all kinds of fact sheets and infographics and all kinds of stuff. They really have put a lot of thought into their advocacy for this. So
Yeah, and real quick, if I may, to Kevin's question, rural ADUs on well and septic system, that, yeah, it all comes down to the capacity of the existing system. And it also comes down to how those local officials interpret that capacity. There have been issues of capacity where if you were to add a new bathroom onto your home, well, you're not exceeding capacity. But if you add an ADU that maybe is a 1-bathroom ADU, suddenly you're triggering more capacity. So that really comes down to just working within the local system. And Chris, the other panelist, probably can offer good insights on well and septic.
That's really interesting. You know, I see my pal Patricia Duarte, hi, typed into the chat that Phoenix, the city of Phoenix, approved legalization of casitas, which is what we in Arizona call ADUs. So that's really interesting. I didn't realize that, Patricia, and I have no idea what the state of Arizona says about, if they have any stance on this issue. I know that here in Tucson, they did a design competition, so there's, 10 different design possibilities, but I don't feel like it's gotten as far as Phoenix has. So everybody, again, we're going to send out all the information that we have access to from our speakers in a follow-up email to you. I myself feel like this is a role that I'm going to encourage the Center for Community Progress to take on to try and start to, they do such a good job with other policy issues about banking examples of legislation and policies and all of that. So maybe we can all get a place where we know where to go and what our next step is, no matter where we find ourselves right now. So one more thank you to our presenters. And just to let everybody know, we have a really great webinar coming up next week, Why Every Middle Neighborhood Needs a Strategy to Thrive. I don't know why it's why every middle neighborhoods, but it's going to be Alan Malik and Todd Swanstrom, the co-authors of a new book out about neighborhoods in America. And they are going to customize their sort of presentation about their book in the context of middle neighborhoods and the market forces that affect them and the kinds of factors that every middle neighborhood practitioner really needs to be taking into consideration. And in March, we're starting to work on something about new market tax credits, which we have watched some CDFIs really, exponentially increase the amount of capital they have to use to build new housing far beyond what they've been able to do with other previous traditional sources of subsidies. So that's going to be interesting. We have an engagement chat on April 17th, which is something we do every quarter for those of us involved in community engagement. So thanks again, everybody, and email us with your ideas for webinars, case studies, news stories check out Center for Community Progress, their webinar series called Cornerstone, and we'll have an evaluation in the follow-up. Have a great rest of your week, everyone.